So if you want to do research on the impacts of pesticides on pollinators, we are not going to do that, but we're going to help you do that. So we are here with Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS. I'm USGS, and we're supporting research, inventory, and monitoring of other groups mostly. So we're trying to lift all these boats. And what we do is things that other people won't do, the boring things, like we work on statistics, we work on online identification keys because IDing bees is very tricky. It's microscope work, really. And we identify bees for people. All these grad students coming into the lab all the time, and many other groups because they don't know how to ID them. So we help, we double check their work. We maintain a huge database of people's works from their results that's publicly available. And we take very high resolution pictures. I'm going to stop there. Those pictures you'll see, they're available on our Flickr site, and feel free to download them and do whatever you want. No holds, all public access. Okay, here is North America, and people have a relatively weak understanding because why would they, right? They're small, bees are small, they're hard to see. You have to look at them in the microscope. They don't really sting. The native bees don't really sting you or any of that kind of thing. But in that space, way over 4,000 species of bees. And the way to think about it is to think of it similar to the things that you know well, like plant groups, faunas, ecosystems, the birds, all are following this same general pattern. I'm hoping that people can see my arrow. I think that's usually the case. So what we have bees that are corralled or endemic to or are specialized in all the big habitat ecosystems within North America and specialize in that. The world of bees is a world of specialization. We'll talk about the plants, but it's also in terms of distribution and region. So in the east, you have this huge deciduous forest here. You have peninsular Florida, different set of bees. Coastal sand dunes, different set of bees. You have the prairies, and that also invade into the east, different set of bees. Boreal forest, that is also filled with very different kinds of bees. Then to the south, you have the Rocky Mountain and the coastal range axis. You have the basins in between, and you have especially these deserts. So surprisingly, and also we don't have much time to talk about it, this is where your biodiversity is. The hotspot is the deserts of the Southwest. Each of these states down through here, 1,000 species of bees each. Over here in the east of the Mississippi, 700 bees, which is a lot, right? That's more than bird species for sure. And there's a lot going on. So that's a very general way to think about it. You think about it just like you do all the other plants and animals. Now let's just dial right into where we live, you live, and how that might be impacting bees, and also where's the place that we can have a big impact. So we live in homes, we live in spots, we use food, we play and we work in spots. All of those are essentially giant negatives to bees, right? You've replaced whatever the natural communities were, and now you've moved in things like roads, highways, your deck, all these kinds of places that absolutely support zero bees. Lawns too, nearly zero, basically. And then you have many other kinds of ornamentations, like the vegetation might not be native. Bees are highly specialized, just like Doug Ptolemy would say for caterpillars, not very supportive. And we could go on. We could look at agriculture in the same sort of way. Huge biodiversity loss. You know this by looking at the plants that are in your city and around your house, in your lawn, for example. And you also know that by the birds. City birds are not birds that are in conservation concern, right? Sparrows, crows, starlings, all that kind of stuff. Very different thing that's being supported there. Still lots of birds, many densities could be higher than in the natural environment, but not where the conservation action is. Now, the good news is that unlike birds or wolves or bison, you can bring stuff into your yard. Okay, so you can bring these bees, you can recover, you can rejuvenate, you can tie back into the surrounding natural environments and create a place that bees of conservation concern, not just like your crow and sparrow bees, which exist, but bees that are uncommon that need support right in your yard. So that's where I'm coming from. I want your yard and your landscape and the places you work and the things you mention to people that they might do because you are an influencer now, because you know something, you know the secrets that we will be talking about in this talk, the secrets to saving bees, which is not like stop pesticides. Important, maybe, but it's more about taking back nature into the places that were lost by our own actions, right? We've created a habitat that we like, and it just turns out that that is not a great habitat for much of our natural environment. But it doesn't have to be that way. And this is more and more critical because there's more and more of us, and we tend to use up bigger and bigger spaces. I'm going to stop harping on this, but basically, you give a guy 10 acres and he'll put a house in it and he'll mess all the rest up because he'll make it into lawn. I blame men for a lot of this. Okay, we have to talk honeybees. So honeybees are not like native bees one little bit. We know, though, lots about honeybees. Every 5-year-old on up knows what a honeybee is. How fantastic is that? But it's a terrible model for a native species. So we're not going to talk about this very much, except to say, if you know something about honeybees, don't apply that to the natives. So remove your Rolodex and replace it with a new Rolodex of information about native species because the overlap is almost nil. So planting flowers, I'm advocating for this, right? Plant flowers. What about stinging? So stinging issues with bees are really in terms of outright damage, like, well, my darling is allergic. That's a honeybee issue. And flowers are not defended by bees. So you can wade right into a field of flowers filled with bees and you're not going to get stung. Now, I have to say that if your darling catches a honeybee in his hands, we're not talking about that. But in general, you're not bringing stinging issues into a new place by adding in native plantings and flowers and things along those lines. And you really only have to worry about in terms of actual damage, because no one is allergic to native bees. They're only allergic to honeybees. And I'll just, as an aside, too much to talk about here. If bees, I'm air quoting here, come out of the ground while you're mowing, those are not bees. Those are yellow jackets, which are wasps. Very interesting and important, but different story. Just don't blame
Vivid choices
on the yellow jackets of the world. Okay, so we really don't have time to get into lots of details here, but roughly 4,000 species north of Mexico. Canada has our bees, but only a subset of them. And there is only 1 or 2 species of bees that are endemic to Canada that don't also occur in North America. Remember, that was all under glaciers at one point. So we slosh back and forth, and our mountain ranges capture many of these northern species. In Maryland, where I'm from, 450 species. The county I live in, my computer loves doing that. We have about 300 species right in PG County. Every yard in North America has access, which is different from having them, has access to at least 100 species of bees. Whether they're there or not depends on what you have done with your yard. If you are planting the right kinds of plants, you can have 100 species of bees. So I want you to look at, I'm going to talk very briefly just to show you diversity and to get you thinking. I want you to look at these flower shapes and sizes in a very broad way and think, why is that flower like that? Here's spurge. That's that little creepy thing, that mat-like stuff that comes onto your into your sidewalk cracks and is very tough and is also a little bit of a weed almost always in mulch beds and things like that. It has flowers, real tiny flowers, and little tiny bees size of a grain of rice. That's lazy blossom calodum as one example of many that are that small. Most bees are the size of a grain of rice. The bulk of living matter is the size of a grain of rice, and most people have no idea. They nest in the ground. You step on their nests all the time. They don't defend their nests. And they're quite pretty if you have a microscope. Hawkweeds, a weed, right? This occurs in some people's lawns if they're particularly friendly to pollinators, but often along roadsides and other sort of waste places. Some are native, some are not. But like all flowers, so we go back, look at that flower. That's very different than the previous one in terms of its architecture. And there are bees that specialize. In other words, here's Andrina cridia, which is a specialist on cridia, which is a one of the groups of flowers in that um, previous picture. A lovely native plant that you might look at and say, oh, there's a hawkweed, or there's a little tiny, you know, dandelion or something. But this small bee, that's also, you know, not much bigger than a grain of rice, is feeding on those plants. Thimbleweed, common spring, well, common-ish spring flower of the forest, which is an important area. We'll find out. Here's another set of small bees. Many small bees go to this. Here's one, Lazy Glossum oceanicum, beautiful blue-ish species. Blueberries. Okay, look at the shape of blueberries, right? And if we looked at thimbleberry, you would have seen a very different architecture. Here it's vase shaped, and if you look closely, the stamens are not individually accessible. They're in groups, and they basically have pores in which, out of which, we'll see a better shot of this, pollen drains out if you shake it, if you sing it the right song. And if you're a bee, that means you have to unhinge your wings and buzz to get the pollen to come out. Otherwise, you don't get it, or you get just leftovers. Here's one of the bees that does do that. That vase shaped, here you have a bee with a very long face. It can stick its proboscis way down there. And it has, you know, there are many features of Andrina bradleyi, which is a vaccinium specialist, one of which is that it knows the song and it needs blueberries. So, side thing, blueberries, you can plant them in your yard. You can get blueberries out of them. They have to be a good plant for bees, because if they weren't, you wouldn't get any blueberries out of them. So your fruits, your fruit bushes and your trees, those are almost all really good plants for bees. Similarly, holly, you know, what would holly be if it didn't have berries? So people mess with hollies all the time, but the fact that they have berries means that pollination is happening because they're dioecious. There's male trees and female trees. Together they create a holly berry. Holly berry, interesting. And you have a world-class swarm of bees around that bush, like Andrina alleghaniensis, when it is blooming. And it looks good, and it fits in the neighborhood. It meets so many criteria. Golden Alexander's is a great ground cover, by the way, not planted that often, but it has a small set of bees. So these are all many, many, many tiny, I'm pointing so I could see this. They has many, many, many very small flowers to make one, what we would call flower. And it really, in that kind of situation, these kinds of things in the umbelliferous groups are going to have very small bees working them. Very easy to access. You can kind of have small lapping tongues. And here's Andrina zizia, aptly named, because that's the scientific name of Golden Alexander's, the genus name. Horse nettle, like no one grows horse nettle. It's a weed. It looks ugly. It's got spines, and it is dynamite for bumblebees, which, if you look here, poriferous stamens, you have to shake them to get the pollen out, and bumblebees do that. And so even something that we see no particular merit in, from our purposes, still a big player in the environment. Very small passion flower. So this is Passiflora lutea, and that flower is nowhere near like the maypop's lovely big giant thing and the other species that produce fruits that we eat. It's small, and there is a little tiny bee in this same group, the Protandrina or Pseudoponergus group, but you knew that. And you plant that, and it makes a lovely trellising feature of about mid-Atlantic south. If I'm talking east, and I don't know what it does in the west. Fleabanes in the east, in the Midwest, total weed, but native, and it has a whole suite of species that bees that come to it. Vervain, so blue vervain, likes kind of semi-wet feet, but look at these flowers. So a sequence of flowers from base to tip that's blooming over days and days and days, and that's providing sort of a constant, steady source of pollen and nectar for not big bees, but small bees. Another small bee one. Here's a big bee plant, turtlehead, late in the season when the queen bumblebees are being produced from nests. And look at this. This does not look like a flower in a way, because if you're looking at who is getting access to the private parts where the pollen and nectar is, it's big bees. So basically bumblebees, carpenter bees, muscle in, get the goods, and then go back out. The little bees are like, can't get in there. So that's the MO. So you can see these flowers that we just sort of look at and enjoy, as we should, colors are presenting not for us, but for bees and a few other insect species. But in general, bees, here's one that presents also to hummingbirds. So that orange-red spectrum, that's a hummingbird color. If it's bright red, it is a hummingbird thing, because bees don't see red. They do see yellow, and orange is okay. And what's going on here? Nectar down at the tip. You either have to crawl back there, a very, very tiny bee, or you have to be a big bee, like a bumblebee, muscle in and drink from there, or you have to have a hummingbird tongue and get in there. In the meantime, up front, can't really see this, pollen and nectar is dabbed on you. Milkweeds, interestingly, pollen is unusable by bees. They're sachets, packets, if you will, that clip on to large bees and butterflies. But the reward is unbelievable amounts of nectar. At least one species of milkweed has been shown to use 35% of its total energy budget, meaning for all the energy it's producing for flowers and for roots and all that, into nectar. And so it needs many bees to visit it, and only the big ones get clipped on. Buttonbush wetland plant, lots of plants in wetlands are great providers for bees. Again, you can tell if it's got a colorful flower, including white, it's attracting bees, sometimes butterflies. Buttonbush is split in a difference. These small components here, these individual flowers, let's call them, lots of little bees all over this. These big ones, that's to get skippers and butterflies, right? So the stamens are poking up, the butterfly or the skipper lands on it, and which, remember, butterflies and skippers could care less about pollen, but they're getting dabbed with it by landing on this flower. So that's what's going on with buttonbush. Redbuds, kind of another story of muscling in. So where are the private parts? They're inside, not as big as turtlehead, but we're talking leafcutter bees, osmias that have some heft, some shoulder, can get in there and pull out the pollen and nectar from that particular tree. Ornamental as heck, and a great thing to plant, particularly if you're just avoid, things that say in the ornamental tree thing that are hybrids of any kinds, because a lot of times everything is gone in terms of pollen nectar loan to the animals. So you just want, as much as possible, a straight native. Groundsel tree, this is Baccharis hamifolia in the east. Baccharis is also out west. And you're seeing this all over the place. It doesn't look much like a pollinator plant, but it is highly attractive to bees in the very late part of the year. Again, I'm basing it on eastern bees. Spring beauties, deciduous woods, understory, vernal, comes out super early in the spring, has a set of bees, as do many plants that bloom in that understory in early spring in deciduous forests in the east, that only occur at that time of year, only occur on those flowers. In this case, there is a spring beauty bee that gathers lovely pink pollen. Corydalis, I have no idea what's going on here. What a crazy looking plant. I can't even come up with a story. I'm sure someone has figured it out, but not me. So now we'll just get into guidelines, right? We're not going to talk a lot of detail. I love detail. It's overwhelming because so many bees, so many flowers, so many options. Look around you. What is in your area for native plants? You can look at iNaturalist. That's what you want to start bringing into your garden. Especially look at any adjacent woodlots, any adjacent grasslands, any adjacent desert areas. What's next to you that's blooming, and start curating those. We don't have time to talk about how you might do that, but those are the flowers you want to bring in. Now, very general rules. Big colorful flowers is that's a bee plant, okay? And what you want are native plants because of this relationship that we'll talk about a little bit more, but we're speaking of all the time, which is many bees are only going to a small number of flowers. You don't have those flowers, they're not there. Some bees only go to willow, some bees only go to pickerelweed, and we can go on and on. And the deserts, 40 to 50% of all the bees in deserts are highly specialized. Creosote bush has like 25 bees that only go to creosote bush in the deserts. I don't know if you want to plant creosote bush in your yard, but why not? It's really supportive. So native plants, diversity of native plants, right? Because of the specialization, the more you plant a diversity of plants, the more you're lifting the boats of, so to speak, of many different kinds of bees, even if you don't know the details. So you don't need to know the details. Lots of different native plants in the space that you have allocated for you to live in, and replacing lawn areas with that is highly positive. Different colors. Plants have blooms of different colors for a reason. They're attracting certain, we've done tons of experiments with this. Just the color alone is highly attractive to bees. That's what they look for when they come out of the nest. They don't have an app. They don't have they don't talk to mom, she's dead. They just have to start finding their preferred food source. And the first cut always is visual. There is a yellow thing in the distance. I'm going to go fly to it because yellow means good. And then it will do, the tasting and the testing, and then it will pick up the scent of that particular plant that it's looking for and try and find more of the same. So different colors in your garden, just a good thing. Different shapes. We talked about several of these kinds of shapes. Good thing. More shapes, better. Don't worry about the details, but if you want to, you can find out about those things. Seasonality, any region has a sequence of bee species that come out at different times for about a 7-week window, would be a generality. There's a few bees that are out the entire season. Think of bumblebees, for example. But most bees are out for only a short period of time. And why? Because flowers are doing the same thing. There is a sequence of flowers, of bloom throughout the year, and many of these bees are highly specialized. Why would they come out when their flower is not blooming? They don't. They're in the ground the rest of the year as nestlings, if you will, waiting to emerge when the signals are appropriate for willow or some of the roses or mints or whatever it is. Red buds are coming out. So that gives you just a broad canvas about what you might do without knowing a lot of the details. So some other things to think about is vines. So many vine species, we've talked about a couple already, are highly attractive and useful and specialized on. So for example, in the upper right is Ipomaea pandurata, widespread throughout the Midwest and into the Southeast, and in fact, quite weedy. It is a fine and dandy and lovely morning glory. It also is a perennial and has, its other name is manroot. And it's basically a sweet potato that doesn't taste that good. And so no one really uses it for that. But it has these big tubers underground, and it comes back year after year, has blooms open up early in the morning, and there is 1 or 2 species of bees, lovely little things that only go to that plant, and they're only out early in the morning. And then when that plant's done, that bee's gone too. And we can tell stories about each of these other vines, but we're a little behind. Shrubs. So when we talk about things that bees specialize on, the bulk are shrubs or perennials. Annuals, not so much. Trees, not so much. So again, you want to do good things. That shrub perennial category is where a lot of action is. So we have a listing that you'll see of these relationships that you can look up and for each of the regions of the country. So for example, viburnums, or that might be, that's probably a Swida group cornus, so a dogwood, not viburnum, but it looks like it. And so that group has a set of bees that only go to that Swida group. Actually, I think it is now called Swida. It's no longer called cornus. Taxonomy. Okay, Lyonia, maleberry, several different species. Some like it wet, some are dry. a whole set of bees only goes to Lyonia. And look at it, it's basically a Pyrrhus replacement. So instead of buying this weird thing from another country that doesn't attract that much, here's your specialist bee bush, and looks good as a shrub. This, I believe, is Aronia, so chokecherry, chokeberry, produces great fruit, needs a little bit of sweetening sometimes, but high in all kinds of nutritional components for your garden. Buttonbush, here's the native azaleas. So those Himalayan azaleas that everyone plants, they are basically worthless. So a few bees will go to those. A lot of them are hybrids and sort of really not functional anymore. But the natives have a specialist bee that is small. These are big blooms. Climb out to the end of that stamen, gather a little pollen out there. But this plant is really aiming for big butterflies, the swallowtails. Look at those stamens, right? So, and this sort of dangles down, and so the swallowtail has to come up and get the nectar. Remember, it doesn't care about pollen, and it's getting dabbed all over the place by the pollen. It goes to the next flower, boom, the plant gets what it wants, which is pollination. And the butterfly gets what it wants, which is nectar within a woodland setting that it can then go and place its eggs on some of the trees that it uses. Trees, so I mentioned there's not that much specialization in trees. There is a little. We don't have time to talk about the really interesting story of chestnuts and the really interesting story of willows, and really only black willow. The rest are shrubby. But a thing to think about in terms of trees, they tend to get not focused on. We're all planting pollinator gardens, right? Small things. But a tree is three-dimensional. And so look, for example, in that center bottom here, this crab or apple is covered in bloom. The amount of pollen and nectar in that one blooming tree is unbelievable. And when you actually, go there and do counts or look at it and things, this is alive with pollinators, unbelievably alive. And same would be true of cherries and several of the other species. Holly is not a rosaceous thing like these are. Blackberries also really good, but these are all what we call party plants. So this group, not bees, not ribbuds, it has its own fauna of bees. But the party plants are the opposite of many of the other kinds of plants, which put in secondary poisons and things that are distasteful to bees and manipulate the chemistry. These are like open flower, very simple. Child would draw these flowers, tons of pollen, tons of nectar, no poison. It's like we want everyone to come and we'll get pollinated. So, but we're only going to bloom for a week and a half. So no bee can really specialize on them because it's too short of time period. They need pollen and nectar for that 5, 6, 7 week period. So much. Okay. We've covered a lot of these plant things very quickly. And now it's just some general rules to think about when thinking about what do I do with this landscape, or how do I advise other people, or how do I talk to municipalities? How do I talk about what needs to be done at the edges of playing fields and other things that are where the parking lot is, what to bring things back. Remember, bees are small, so it doesn't take much. For example, one sunflower head, the big kind that you imagine in your mind as a sunflower head, that has enough pollen in there to populate 100 bee nests, so 100 cells. So that's a lot. So one clump of anything is going to be a positive, not be like, that's really not enough, but it is. So general rules, more blooming shrubs and trees into woodland edges. You can tell I'm an Easterner, right? So we assume there's going to be woods, but in the West, we're also talking about some of these other kinds of places. You don't want to plant into closed canopy, but we divide the landscape up so much. So all the roads and road cuts and the driveway to our house basically are shearing open the woods. And normally we would say, well, that's not a good thing, but you know what? Too late. It's already happened. But the good part is that if you look inside the woods, shrubs and basically shrubs, let's call it, and not worry about like subcanopy trees like dogwoods, basically are just hunkered down. Like they are struggling. They might be decades old and they're not producing out much pollen they're not producing much bloom because they're not getting much light. So they don't have a lot of energy for that kind of stuff. When I hunt bees, I hunt around the edges because the edges where light comes in, that's where all the action is for pollinators, and the plants love it. They're blooming. So that's where you have this opportunity to plant into these natural edges on man-made cuts. So right at that edge, planting that full of shrubs and trees, which is the natural part, the natural component, and cutting out and replacing the invasives that also like to pop up in there. Controlling deer, many parts of the North America has a deer problem. What do they eat? They eat native species. They really turn their nose up on invasive species, sadly. So sometimes you have to think about controlling the deer directly, or controlling the environment so that deer don't have access. Spring vernals, sweet woodlands, eastern thing again. So understory in woodlands that have that are bottomlands full of moisture, are not terribly acidic to sweet, or have a high what is that? They are not neutral, but the opposite. You know what I'm talking about. Ericaceous shrubs is where the action is in acidic woodland. So think of southern pine, think out west. Also, a lot of acidic open understory woodlands, scattered trees, burning, many different kinds of things out in the west. You move to the deserts, you get these desert shrubs. That's a driver for a lot of this biodiversity, is those shrubs that are picking up on the particular conditions of the environment. And sandy soil. So and in most places, it's mostly about the general average landscape and the biodiversity of the plants in that landscape that's driving whether you have these uncommon, in need of support bees. Then you have areas of sand. So it could be large rivers. So for example, the Mississippi has all these sand areas that are only along the Mississippi because they're depositing it. And then you have places along the coast that are literally sand dunes, right? And then you have to the interior, you have sand dunes that are residual sand dunes because at one point it was part of an ocean, or all kinds of different things for sand. The sandhills of Nebraska, one of my favorite places. There are bees that have to nest in the sand and often have to have plants that grow primarily in the sand, and they have to be open sand. So if you have sandy soil, you want to plant those sand-loving plants, and you don't want to try and force it into a turf situation. This is one of the biggest problems with like sand mines. After a sand mine has been mined, just walk away. That's the best thing you could do for plants. And a generality, we often lose in our environment big yellow fall blooming composites because society as a whole likes to keep things mowed. You mow it once or twice a year, that's all it takes. Those composites can't make it. So those big, lovely helianthus and other things like wingstem and whatever the Western counterparts would be, those are things we want to foster. And you might also think about planting them more because those are components that just disappear quickly. When you are in an environment that you control, think about feathering your edges into that natural environment rather than putting in a pollinator garden right in the middle of the lawn or right next to your house per se. Still good things, but the plants and animals are not that, like, they don't really want to walk across a bunch of lawn or fly across it. It's vulnerable to them. We really want to take a nature first thing and allow nature to come in, invite them in. So all the different kinds of animals are going to start using that environment. And yes, sometimes you have to be neat and tidy and put everything's in a mulch pile in a row, all that. But the better way is complexity, lots of different kinds of plants, can be just several. Don't get all hung up on big mulch spaces between, or that you might have some weeds in there. The dominant things should be the native plants, and don't worry about the details. So replacing lawn, it basically goes without saying. And when you have a larger acreage, again, thinking more east than anything, but Midwest too, this is a prairie type of thing. You want to mow it once a year. So you don't know what to do with it, or it's like prairie, or maybe wants to be prairie, or you just don't want it to grow back into woods. Don't mow the heck out of it in the middle of the growing season because you're mowing bloom. 5 flowers equals one bee nest on average. Most flowers, of course, are small. And so, in thinking about this, what you want is um, to mow in the winter, and you could wait 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and still not get into trouble. You might have to use bigger equipment. You might have to be brush hogging, but some of you have access to through the community these larger places. So, what are these larger places? Roadsides, underneath power lines, gas lines, all kinds of rights of way that are not being used really for lawns, right? We just have a lawn mentality. Everything, Chamber of Commerce viewpoint is if we make everything into lawn, then we're going to attract more people to put in more houses. So anyway, the general thing is also think as a strategy, what can I do to make these wildish areas presentable? And often the answer is you have to also pair it with highly maintained areas. So I'll show you a couple pictures in a second, but think about roadsides in particular. Is there really any reason to go way up the banks of the roads and mow that all the time, all during the summer? You need to mow the verge, one big mower deck, so that cars can get off it. And then the rest should be mowed once a year or once every 3 years to make your lines of sight visible and to keep it not treed if that's your goal. So if we look at, okay, well, what's the biggest impact that anyone, any group, anything can go on? It's basically super easy. Stop mowing, right? You'd still want to mow, but stop mowing, shift your mowing to something else, and just immediately you are supporting so much more, and mowing costs go down, gas use goes down, the pollution produced by these inefficient machines goes down. You have to work directly with the facilities people, the maintenance departments, and the guy on the tractor so they understand what you're asking them to do and why. Don't be elitists, invite everyone to the party. So just a few things. We're running out of time, so I'm gonna just brief this. So some bees nest in holes. Just give your grandchild a portable drill and tell them to drill holes in anything that is not living wood, and that will be good. Bees are picky eaters, so these are, now we're talking very specifically, many, and I mentioned this, do crazy things. Weird plants like dodder is always my favorite one to talk about, have specialist bees that only go to it, and you would be surprised. You can be less surprised by going to some of Jared Fowler's work, and you can snapshot that, or you can look it up. Maybe someone could put it in the chat. Go to his site, and you'll see on the left the bee, which probably no one cares about because it's all scientific names. But look here on the, but you just want to know, like, oh yes, that bee, that's the one I'm supporting. And here are lists, usually just family level, because a lot of times we don't know the species level, but you'll see patterns: Helianthus, willow, Asteraceae of different kinds, and but surprisingly many different kinds of groups. And those, and most of these, they can't be rare, right? If they're rare, they can't support a specialist bee because the whole system falls apart. These are relatively common plant groups that you should be able to find and bring into your yard. And you can then have a pick of interesting plants just within that. But that's your first cut. Go to the specialist list, pull out plants from that, fill in with more native generalist plants like the mints, and then finally, what the heck, zinnias, all these other non-native pretty plants that you grew up with. Why not? Don't get all uptight. So I point this out to say, why do we do this, right? This is kind of crazy. We took an environment, that environment, right, that I'm looking at right now was a natural habitat. Your house was natural habitat. Any place you look was some kind of natural habitat. Maybe it was occupied by indigenous cultures, but they rotated through these things. It eventually was, again, native habitat. And then we came in, we scrape every bit of it is gone. Then we replace it with a non-native single species that takes unbelievable amounts of work to maintain as this, which is culturally acceptable. And again, we look at men as a problem, and this is the signal to other men in the neighborhood that they are, manly. They can't go out and beat each other up, and they can't, go to war and do all these. There's no hunting really anymore. Can hang a big deer on your front porch, but they can have this. So we have to like shift this balance. So the goal, less lawn and work from the edges in, and society will be beneficial. So here is my house. This is the house I'm talking in right now. And what you're seeing is the sort of a general approach to how to do this. So you'll notice I have bedding plants. You want bedding plants around the house. That's is not acceptable to have just bunches of plants crawling up all over that appear to be weeds. And you have to have all your paths string trimmed, and you have to have all your front facing elements like the sidewalk, the edge of the road, your driveway, your neighbor's fences, all have to be maintained with an inch of its life with a string trimmer. Battery, I should point out, battery operated string trimmers are great now these days. And then the rest of the area, you get a pass, right? I don't know what you're doing in that interior space, but you clearly did it on purpose. You're keeping up the neighborhood with all this mowing and neat and tidiness, and that's good enough. And so that's the approach. Don't just stop mowing, or your neighbor will mow you, or maybe call the police for a welfare check. Maybe they've passed away in there. Their lawn is so long. Anyway, here's another shot of my house. This house again, straw bales. You don't have to go that route either. Green roofs, all kinds of good things. And what I do is I'm manipulating this environment all the time. I like to do that, other people less so. So I have paths through here. This is several years ago. It's now completely changed. I have moved plants around. At the end of the year, in the winter, I mow things down. I throw down lots of chips. I say, these plants are too vigorous. I'm moving them somewhere else. And you can see in the background, you can see the wood's edge, which is, I have to say, really junky woods that were formerly sand and gravel mined, but is still woods. And I'm feathering in, and because there's bottomlands that are in okay shape down below, I am getting all sorts of activity by all kinds of wildlife because of that. And then I have a really robust set of bees that are using my area. And this is my ideal. Now, even like horrible places, like this is a gravel parking lot. And the gravel parking lot, you can see the gravel on the left. That's what it was on the right. All we did is I asked the facilities, just, give me a once over with the rototiller on this spot just to repress things. And then we put 8 inches of chip on that right from the arborist truck. And then we planted right in it. You get this, and I go in once a year and cut down all the stems at the end of the year, just a little neat and tidy. Have I done it this year? No, I have not. But and then in the spring, I go in and I do one weeding of the whole area just to keep the really thuggy weeds, knock them back. I want what I got, which is primarily native plants. And I don't water it. I never watered it once during the whole time period. Chips are magic. Okay, we're really closing down here. And here is another example. These are the kinds of things you can do in your yard. I stopped mowing an area just to see, like, well, what would come up? And the answer is nothing much. There's one in the back. Here's a Symphotrichium, I think. And here is Parthensis quinquefolia. So what is that? Virginia creeper. And it's like, this is not great. And the rest is just repressed grasses because I mowed it all the time. So I went in and I weed whacked it, which is completely optional, right? So there's no really need. If you put 8 to 12 inches of chip on top of this, it's going to mat it all down. It's not going to be able to push through that anyway. So you might as well not even bother with the mowing. And that's what we do now. And no cardboard, no newspaper like you read on YouTube. And we just bury it all in chip. And then when I want to plant, what I do is the rule is we have plugs, we have whatever. It's going to be not seeds, of course, is you pull the mulch out a little volcano and then you expose the soil layer, the top of the soil layer, and each of these plants has to, the bottom of the plant, now taken out of the pot, of course, has to touch that soil, and then you tuck it back in, and it's like they go crazy in there. I don't do any rototilling. This is crappy soil, and also hard pan because of all, just a million years of abuse. But the insects, because of all this chip, are rototilling the soil underneath and bringing it out, bringing it up, changing the soil structure, adding in fungal communities and bacterial communities, which are providing the plants with all the nutrients they need. So there's no additional fertilizers or anything needed. Here is the garden last year, which was previously simple. You can kind of see it in the back. It was just a mowed once a year area. So it was full of poison ivy, every invasive vine you can think of, and a blackberry and other shrubby things, some native, some not, but we wanted to shift it to some of our study plants. And so we did that, but we had a lot of empty spaces. So we just said, let's put in vegetables. So we have corn and, oh my God, the pumpkins that year were awesome. And, throw in some sunflowers in different areas in between our beds, which are our study beds in this particular case, but this could be your lawn. And super easy to do. I got a lot of food out of it, which I enjoy as sort of a side benefit. We used also a lot of the vines as suppressive ground cover. And so you can combine all kinds of things together. We have a bumblebee finder. So we've done a bunch of bumblebee studies, which I don't have time to talk about. And a lot of that was distilled into a guide. I'm not sure how far west this goes. Let's say it's New England, or let's say it's the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic Northeast. And you can put in the criteria that you want, and from the bumblebee side and the plant side and the season side, and it will create a bumblebee garden for you. Here just to intrigue you are some of the results from our bee study. Some of you may have participated in these bumblebees. Here's our number one plants in this particular analysis. We've done others now. And you can see these are not surprising, right? But what is surprising is like, whoa, look at these coneflowers of brown-eyed Susans and other Rebecca. Pretty darn low down on the list. Dandelion, the last one before you get to zeros, phlox, and other things. Really not of interest to bumblebees, which are generalists, but not that generalists, right? They are expressing choice within an environment. Lots of details in here. These are just a list of zeros. You might say, hey, Joe Pyeweed, I know bumblebees go to that. Well, not the Joe Pyeweed that was under evaluation in this particular thing, but the rest of the stuff, zeros. Like you can put as much arrow as you want, and bumblebees thumb their noses, at least when they have opportunities in the east for something better. Okay, second to last slide. Also, many other insects are supported by flowers. Good, we don't have time to talk about them. Here is the end, and here is my resource information. All the pictures are all public domain. We have a 5,000 plus picture catalog. You can search it. It's named and tagged all over the place. It's located on Flickr, and you'll get the highest resolution picture. You can absolutely do whatever you want with them. You can claim that you took it. Other people sell ours on Etsy and eBay. I saw recently, my favorite one was a set of yoga pants that were covered in our bee pictures. And, the world's your oyster. We don't care. It's forward facing. We want our pictures out there. You can citing us is great, but we don't need that. And We want you to use them in displays. We want you to use them on billboards. We want you to put them on your homepage and have them as screensavers, all that. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and jump back in, and you guys tell me if there's, I'm available. So if there's time, we can talk.
Yeah. Sam, that was fantastic. We have a bunch of questions
Okay.
and I'm going to curate them the best I can, but I'm going to start with one that didn't come right in the beginning. And
Uh-huh.
it's from somebody named Molly Jacobson. And she
Oh,
said, I
I know
just
Molly.
wanted, yeah, that's what I thought. That's why I wanted to say this first. She said, I just wanted to praise Sam for his expertise as a
Oh,
polologist myself. Um, Very little bee research in the East would be possible without his contribution and generous collaborations. So he's so glad he's given this talk. So
yeah,
that's
great.
just
Well,
one
and I
good
get a
thing.
lot from Molly and other people who visit. So, like, I'm not going to upstate New York to collect bees. I would like to, but I have lots of other things to do and other places to go. But Molly has done a bunch, and now through her collecting and her specimens, I learned, oh, here's what's going on north of the Finger Lakes in areas north of Syracuse.
Oh,
So it's two-way. Thanks,
good.
Molly.
So going back to the kind of the beginning, somebody wanted to know if you could recommend a site or source for information on night pollinators.
So night pollinators. So first of all, we're talking about moths
Right.
and bats in the West. So the book, which is now 15, maybe 20 years, Forgotten Pollinators, is a good general introduction to some of that kind of, including bees. Good storyteller. Steve Buckman's a great storyteller. And other than that, I'm sure there are, but that's not my skill set. So I'm going to stop.
Okay. Um, if you live in the Baltimore region, which I presume this person does, and can only plant one plant in your garden to support pollinators, what would you plant?
Oh my God. One plant. Well, let's see. I would want something that bloomed for a long period of time. I I have such a difficult time doing that. There would be different objectives, right? Oh, I want to support as many things, so I would probably plant like a red maple, or which surprisingly is a important pollinator thing, or maybe an American chestnut, which would die but does support rare pollinators. I can't really answer that. I'm afraid. Or I would plant Lysomachia ciliata, which is a plant that supports oil collecting bees, because that's cool. But I could just go on and on. It's like,
No, good answers. I read native bees don't have a huge range. How can they come back into a yard if it's in the middle of a city? You have to have a certain proximity to less disturbed habitat.
actually, no. And the reason for this is that so when they establish a nest, they're just foraging in a very small area. Okay. But when they come out of the nest, then that's not foraging, that's dispersing, right? So let they come out of the nest. Theoretically, there was a plant there that they were using because their mom used, right? And so they had built a nest in it. It may still be there, right? Probability is that something is nearby. But if it's not, they just start flying, and they're not redlining the suburbs. They're not redlining even water. We have lots and lots of evidence. I'll give you an example. Here in the DC area, what is the largest parking lot we could find? Redskin Stadium, now called whatever the new name is. I don't follow football. Mile long, half a mile wide, a wonky shape, a little bit, not exactly a rectangle, but that's a huge mound. There was not a crack in it. There were no weeds. There were no islands. There was nothing. And so I have lots of students who need projects. So these lovely high school students put out traps throughout the whole parking lot. I expected to see a bunch of bees at the edge and nothing in the middle. And the question was, well, how far in do they go? No difference. There were just as many bees in the middle being caught as along the edges. And we've seen this on salt pans out in Utah. I have colleagues, they go out 5 miles out into a salt pan, put down traps, bees end up in it. These are individuals that are like, I can't find my food. What am I going to do? Well, they're not looking it up on the internet and they don't have anyone to talk to. So they just start flying and they have cues, color, that kind of thing, but they don't have, again, they don't know, like, don't go in the city or don't go in that salt pan. So they will colonize amazingly small pockets. And yes, there is a limit, right? So you're not going to attract a bee species that is a specialist on a plant that doesn't occur within 100 miles. But you would be amazed at the kinds of crazy things that I've seen from people in their yards. And, they're surrounded by suburbia or concrete.
Yeah. Wow.
You build it, they will come. It's sort of the messaging there, I'd say.
That's so cool. Is there a minimum number of a species for specialist bees that you need to sustain those specialists in your yard?
Well, the answer is probably, right? So, but it's hard to really quantify that because you may have only one plant, but what if your neighbor has 6 plants? What if the wild area nearby has 50 plants? So I wouldn't necessarily get all. So what I'm trying to avoid is having people get tied up in knots, like I'm not doing the right thing, and so they do nothing. So planting a few things, if the plant likes it, it's going to grow bigger or spread, and it might take a while. But a lot of these, and so yes, of course, more is better. But you have only X amount of space, and it may not fit your, design for that particular spot. And so you can, I do this a lot, which is I'll put out a bunch of plants, like, okay, I grow from seed a lot of things, or I'll take cuttings and grow them, and then I put them out. And if it's like, you know what, you like this area, I'll put more of them out. I'll culture them, I'll spread them, or allow them to spread. And a lot of other plants vote by just dying. And so over time, you will see what needs to be in your yard in a way, just by, you don't want to do anything heroic. Like if the plant doesn't want to grow there, move on. And so putting in a lot initially, and then you will begin to develop groups of plants in different areas that thrive in your yard. And you do your observations and say, like, yeah, more of that, less of this.
Here's kind of a big subject here. What is your opinion of keeping honeybees? And is it that it's just too much competition for native pollinators?
Now, I give whole talks on this.
I know you do.
Yeah. So here's the thumbnail on this. First of all, if you want honeybees because you just think honeybees are really cool, you should have honeybees. And if you want honeybees because you want to have your own honey, you should have honeybees. But if you think that you're helping the area, the world, the state, the plants, anything else, by having a honeybee hive, and you don't have really any interest in it yourself per se, you just think like, well, this is good. More honeybees is good. It is not. So there's no ecological role for honeybees. They're not native even to the hemisphere. And guess what, right? We have all these native plants. We have all these native bees. They were doing it for 150 million years without honeybees. So we don't need to bring in honeybees. Even within agricultural systems, it turns out you need honeybees in industrial agriculture. But in most other systems, in the East in particular, right, you don't need honeybees because the native bees will move in to your vegetable garden, will move into your orchards, and then they will move out when it stops blooming or that's not of interest. That's how it rolls. And honeybees are, and I just point out these days, because there are so many now pathogens and sad things about honeybees, it's a lot of work to do that. So if you're thinking I need to do this because it's so good and nature needs it, then really you're just going to be frustrated because it is a lot of work. But the culture of beekeepers is a wonderful one, and they have most areas have beekeeping societies that are really supportive of you as a beekeeper. But again, the thing to avoid is paying someone to bring in hives because you think that bringing in hives to your lovely pollinator meadow is important or needed or useful. That is just not the case. That's the short answer.
How do we find the native plants that are missing from our wild out areas that are beneficial but are considered to be weeds and aren't sold in stores?
Wow. Yeah. So you can start with Jared's list. And then, so for example, he might say helianthus is important for this set of bees. There are places that you can look up maps of these bees and see like, oh, well, these bees are in my area. In fact, I think Jared has links to those maps. And so you can say, okay, well, I want to have Andrina accepta in my yard, and it's a helianthus specialist. What are the helianthus species in my area? And then you go and you dial up iNaturalist and, say, because in iNaturalist, most of you, I think, probably are aware of iNaturalist, but it's wonderful. I contribute all the time. And you can define an area, basically a square around your house, and say, show me all the helianthus species or helianthus records at the genus level for that area. And it will show up. And then you can get a little summary with pictures and say, oh, there's 5 different helianthus species here. Maybe I should try and obtain seeds from the wild or obtain them from a store or online. Prairie Moon, Prairie, various places do sell these seeds. Rare, there's a lot. So you can look up native plants, native seeds. Most states maintain, the native plant societies of a state will maintain a list. That would be my approach. And then you can be trial and error. It'd be like, oh my gosh, what is that plant? Look it up. And then often, again, has a flower, has bees. I'm attracted to that plant, which is down the road from me. See where you can get it. See if you can propagate it by seed or by cuttings, and go wild. So a lot of times, I should just mention, a lot of times these things are not available in the trade, let's say, particularly not your local, stock, let's call it. It's not to go too far down, but a lot of the cultivars are, genetically all the same because they're growing them through vegetative means. And your diversity is going to come from growing your own or going to a native, good, solid native plant producing nursery to provide that genetic diversity. But worst comes to worst, go to Home Depot and buy a plant that says blueberry, because we don't want you to be excluded because it's just like that's too much, and it is for a lot of people, and other people find it fun and attractive. So you can do a variety of things. Go around the neighborhood and look at people's yards, and some people have like, oh my God, look at all the plants that these people have, and they're doing really well. Knock on their door. Don't just take their plants. Knock on their door and ask them. And a lot of times it's like, yeah, in the fall, I split these, come back. And, people are pretty generous, and they also love the fact that you love their garden. And the best way to establish plants is through those kinds of divisions rather than a little pot, right? Because the plant is already established. So when I need to really stick in, I get like have an area just become a robust pollinator thing. I'm not growing up seeds. I'm just dividing what I have if I can. And so those are some options.
Great. Another subject, are the cues bees are using to dictate their emergence mostly temperature dependent or day length dependent? So will there eventually be a disconnect between emergence and food availability as our country warms?
I'm not an expert at that. I would say mostly it's going to be temperature dependent, but I really don't know. And I believe both things work in different systems. So some
Mhm.
are basically have an internal clock that says come out now, and others are queuing in on soil temperatures. So I can't I can't answer that in detail.
Okay. Can you talk a little about leaving stems for stem nesting bees?
I can. So bees nest in different places. A lot of them are in the ground. That's the primary one, if you just do an Excel spreadsheet. But there are quite a number of bees that nest in holes in wood. So these are coming from beetle holes in nature. And then there's another whole set of bees that are nesting in the stems of plants. So it could be a shrub, or it could be a ephemeral shrub like rubus and blackberries. All those are great for this kind of thing. Or it could be a robust perennial, and sometimes they're actually nesting that year. So first of all, most of their jaws are very weak, so they can't really break through the stem wall. So they need some kind of break. And so sometimes it's a wound on a plant, and then that year they'll go right into that sunflower stem and nest and pull off the year. Other times it's um, because a deer browsed it. So positives for deer, or a brush hog comes through and cuts down all the blackberries. So blackberries are particularly attractive to certain groups of bees like Serotina and Hoplites, and they last for several years. So, the blackberry raspberry cycle is year one, a stem comes up and grows and no fruit. Year two, it fruits, then dies at the end of that year. In the meantime, another cycle of canes is coming up. Well, that dead cane, usually people are cutting it right to the ground. The trick there, particularly if with these groups, is to cut about 12 inches off the ground. It is now the perfect nesting habitat. And you'll see the bees using it, and look right down the hole. With the more traditional perennials, like fill in the blank, cone flowers, goldenrods, all kinds of things, it's much more variable as to what they're doing with the cut stem. So, for example, goldenrod grows up year one, okay, and then it flowers and then it dies. Maybe it's broken off. It lasts through the winter, and then in the spring, maybe a bee occupies that broken stem, but it has to use that nest and come out later in the spring, or use it and come out the next year. So, in a lot of ways, you need to have material available over longer periods of time. So you can do it a couple ways. Let's just say your general pollinator garden, you need to, if it's in a neighborhood and out front, make it neat and tidy. Cut it down to the ground or cut it a foot up. So a foot up is pretty acceptable, and bees will nest in that. Cut it to the ground, move that material to the back where no one's looking, and leave it on the edge or even upright. And then bees will figure it out. They use it or not, depending on their proclivities. Throwing it in the compost pile, well, that's not going to help. But you have a bunch of different kinds of options there.
Great. One quick question about just wood piles. Are they good for bees?
When you say wood pile, you're talking about chips?
I'm thinking in this case, because we've got a ton of questions about chips, but I'm thinking this is like, logs for your fireplace kind of piles.
No. Okay, so there's a set of bees. So bees doing all kinds of crazy things. So, and there's so many. So there's a set of bees that nest in rotting wood. So sometimes that rotting wood is way at the top of a tree. It's just a branch that's rotted down. You have it's on its way to creating a hollow in the tree or whatever. But some of those bees will nest in the wood that's soft enough for them to invade, and with their tiny wimpy mandibles make some kind of nesting chamber, or they're using a pre-existing beetle run or whatever it's in there. And others are like, what we want a tree that has fallen down and has started to really rot on the ground. And so there are many other kinds of insects that like fallen wood. So this is an example of you can do a positive thing by not cleaning up everything. So leaving a log where it's not in your way is better than taking it to the dump by 1,000,000%. And sometimes those are, I've seen it many times. Some of those woods, Albiflora pura is a classic example. The bees are nesting in that rotting wood. I can't remember. Is there another part to that?
Well, that was just one straight question, but then I guess when you were talking about your own yard and showing the example of the string trimmer and the wood chips and everything,
Yeah.
lots of questions about wood chips. What kind of wood chips? How deep they should be? Do you add new soil? I mean, just I think
Yeah.
more details.
It's we've played around with a bunch of things, and we have come to the conclusion that simple is better because you're going to do it. Okay, so we talked about no cardboard, no rototilling, no getting rid of the turf, no digging, nothing. You literally can be, today I want to make a pollinator garden. And you say, that's that piece of lawn, that's it. And you go to your chip pile, which of course everyone has a chip pile. And in lots of parts of the country, urban areas in particular, chip companies have a hard time getting rid of their chips. And there's apps called like Chip Drop. And you just sign up and say, hey, I want a truckload of chips. And you'll get an entire truckload, by the way, which you want. And then you just take those chips and you bury the section of lawn that you want, 8 to 12 inches. So somewhere in that 8 to 10 is probably good. First of all, you can do it a couple ways. You can literally put the chips down and plant that day by just burying them in there, and they'll be fine. You can, though, also put the chip down and wait. The level of the chips will drop over a period of time by about half. And so now you've basically killed the substrate, most of them. But if there is like that, in that picture that I showed two things that I mentioned, the Virginia creeper and the frost aster. So they'll punch right up, right? And so will your plants that you plant. But if they're there, they're going to come up. So if there's poison ivy down there, that poison ivy is like, no big deal. I'm just going to come up right through this mulch. But it's easy to detect and to get rid of. And most of the grasses, with some exceptions, Bermuda grass will struggle up. But again, you have an opportunity to pull it out pretty easily in a nice mulched environment where, you're comfortable too. And it's not as heroic or difficult I rototilled it, I planted my plants, the summer came, it baked everything, and then all the tenacious weeds came in. Like, who wants to weed that? So, and then in terms of chip, it can be, basic story is any chip's fine. No exceptions. It can be, you could put in as much walnut in there and toxic things. It doesn't really matter because it's not working that way when you're chipping them. I've never seen or heard of any really bad experience with that. And so you could be, the chip guy is chipped a bunch of trees that day. They bring it over, you put it on, you plant into it, you're good. So it's really flexible. The key thing is don't skimp on them, right? You don't want to be like, well, I covered everything, but then, grass is going to come up if it's 3 inches. Even if it looks covered, you got to have some weight down on there. And the only negative of putting more chip on is that it's harder to plant into it because there's so much depth.
But we're just getting a lot of questions here, and I know you've been going away. Are you up for one or two more?
Sure.
And then yeah. So winter mowing or mowing once a year. How do you, are you destroying ground nesting bird habitat? Are you removing seed heads for birds? That's one question. And then the other one that I've seen here is, how do you control the woody invasives from taking over? And is it okay to just mow every 2 to 3 years and not every year? So just kind of some general mow questions.
Yeah, sure. All of those can work. Okay, so first of all, any action you take has consequences, even non-action, right? So Anything you're doing is favoring some things and not favoring others. So if we look at birds, which is another reason not to mow in the summer, because you could be mowing up their nests, and with consequences to that. The other thing is in the winter, I prefer to leave the stems up until late winter so that birds have access to that. But they still have access to it if you mow it, right? It's just on the ground now and there's less cover for them. So you can do in between things. I am mostly using a brush blade. So I have a good string trimmer, and I actually now use a brush blade on I use a DeWalt, not, I'm not promoting DeWalt, but it's the only one that I found that has it, but I bet there's others. Battery operated string trim, super powerful, and it has a brush blade attachment. I just unscrew it, stick it on, and it's basically a rotating blade. And I can just lay waste to the plant stems really quickly. You can also get these all the time. Like you go to any lawn and garden place, you can get a good weed whacker. You can replace the head with a brush blade. And there's a nice one, a Makita, that we have at work that's 4-stroke. So in other words, uses straight gas, and is designed to be a brush blade. Super nice. And and then you can control the height, right? You decide I'm going to cut high and cut low. And additionally, every 2 or 3 years has big advantages sometimes. So for example, a really good bee plants are blackberries and sumac, which are plants that will exist if you mow them every year, but they don't really like it, and they can't really pull it all off. But you mow it every 2 or 3 years, and yes, you're going to have to use a significantly larger piece of equipment like a brush hog or something to take those down, but that's a positive. So having both those strategies, if you have that available, is good. And this is so think about rights of way. So under a big transmission line, these 500 kilovolt major lines, the power company can't have trees growing up into them, but nor does it really want to mow these things all the time. But landowners and municipalities and who knows what are constantly asking for that. So they have long-term mowing contracts, but you can work with them. They're pretty open to this because mostly what you're going to say is that habitat can be really incredible, right? And so you're saying, you're doing a good thing. I want to work with you to develop this into a pollinator thing because nobody likes transmission lines. So here's a positives. And so if you're an organization, there's a really important place. I'll take that a little step further. So at Patuxent, and I've seen this work several places, and there's groups now that do maintenance on here along these lines, which is why mow everything, right? So really your problem is trees. So what you want to do is control the trees, and then potentially, and I've seen this work unbelievably well, particularly in acidic areas and things where you have all like just massive amounts of huckleberries, blueberries, Lionia, not bush honeysuckles, those are bad, and other plants that are shrub stage things underneath these power lines. And every 5 years they come in and usually means cut and stump treat the trees, and they leave everything else. And again, if they're sophisticated, they'll also take care of the invasive plants. Like you work with them, or you do it. You go in and cut out the bush honeysuckles and the autumn olive and the calorie pear. So that becomes something that doesn't really exist anymore. Remember, again, I have this in Eastern hat, but it works out West too. So indigenous cultures for the past 15,000 years burned the hell out of everything because that was their management tool. And when they did that, they kept things in a much more diverse state. So in the East, everything wants to be woods. If you did nothing, if all the people disappeared, the only places that would not be woods would be the barrier dunes and wetlands. Even all of our lovely barrens and all these kinds of places all woods eventually. And so it was really the indigenous cultures of burning that kept much of the East with many of these open country plants and rare things in prairie like environments. Think of Long Island. Long Island, that would have been trees. They burned, it was Long Island is so filled with sand. It was so easy to burn it and maintain it as grassland. We had heath hens, which are prairie chickens. Why would there be prairie chickens in the East when it was all trees? It was not. Basically a grassland to scrub area. So that's not what would happen if we left, but it is what happened for the past 15,000 years. So there is no like going back to a pure native habitat. It just doesn't exist because we had 15,000 years of manipulation and our own climate change of glacial recession. So it's this crazy environment where we can do lots of things to manipulate the environment. And many of them are positive. So you would look at, well, what's missing right now? Where are the rare bees? Where are the rare plant communities? How can I be supportive of keeping these things? And what do I do if I can't burn? Which in a lot of places in the East, you can't. So you're going to have to do things like, oh my God, these transmission lines are effectively repositories of open country plant and animals, particularly when they go through sand and rocky areas, which of course, that's where they put power lines in crappy areas, not farmland. So there's all these really interesting opportunities to use environments that we think of as corrupted, like who wants a power line, right? But the reality is many of these power lines are where all the rare plant and animal action is, because nowhere else, no one's burning. There are no tribal people left to burn everything. And even if there are, and there are people who want to burn, they are largely, their hands are tied, and you have all these houses dispersed. So I could go on and on.
This has been fantastic. I mean, I think we've really run the gamut of a lot of the questions, some simpler ones that have come in, and I would just encourage anybody who put in a question that we didn't get to. I know this is information that's out there. You can come to the Pollinator Pathway and we can answer some of these questions. Sam, I can't thank you enough. This has been fantastic. And
My pleasure.
you've got,